Well, hello again, everybody. I was really interrupted by my computer right in the middle of speaking about the Powhatan Confederacy and English Powhatan relations in early Virginia. So this is video 2 of 2. One of one, one of two will be posted on YouTube alongside of it. So just make sure that you watch these in the correct order. I don't think it'll have any other effect. I don't think it'll have an effect otherwise, except that you have to watch two videos rather than one. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up with where I left off with, which was in talking about Wahunsakawa, the paramount chief of Chesapeake tribes, the Powhatan Confederacy, which occupied the Chesapeake region, which the English first settled in establishing Jamestown in the Virginia colony. And I think the best way, and you can see the population there is 21,000. So that's a pretty large population, much larger than the English population in the early years of the Jamestown settlement in the Virginia colony. And the best way to think about the relations between the Powhatan and English is actually through the story of Pocahontas, in which we can unpack some of the myths and then compare them with the actual reality of the story of Pocahontas and her interactions with the early English colonists in Virginia. And the reason I speak of a myth and a reality is because most of us who come to this story, or if we have any background knowledge of it, typically it's from the Disney animated movies about Pocahontas. And it's not probably a surprise for you to hear me say that there are some major historical inaccuracies in the Disney animated movies. And yet there are some ways in which the reality of the relations between the Powhatans and English through the story of Pocahontas is actually in some ways told correctly in the story. So it's a good way of sort of thinking about how historical events are interpreted in art, even though, of course, a Disney movie is designed for children. This is where most of us first learn about Pocahontas, and in fact, probably early Virginia. So some parts of the movie, in the first movie in particular, that you may be familiar with are the story, for example, of Pocahontas, the daughter of Wahunsakawa, Powhatan, as the English called him, the paramount chief of the Chesapeake tribes. There's a major plot point in which she saves the heroic John Smith from being captured, from being executed, I should say, by her father. This was not because she loved him, which is what the Disney story would tell us. In fact, it was a much more complex set of relations happening, all of which were related to the basic fact and the reality of the relationship between the Powhatans and English, which was that both sides viewed each other very warily. And both sides hoped to benefit from the development of especially trade relations. So this is not a one-way street, if you will, but each side hoped to gain something valuable in developing relations with each other. What did the English want? I think we've already made that clear, which is that the English, more than anything, initially hoped that the Powhatan would give them access to natural resources or valuable items in Virginia that they could send back to England and to Europe in order to profit from. What the English really hoped the Powhatans could reveal was the location of gold and silver mines in Virginia, not being aware of the fact that there are no gold and silver mines in Virginia. For one example, the Powhatan, on the flip side, tolerated the English presence in the Chesapeake at Jamestown. And I say that word specifically, tolerated it, because they hoped that the small English settlement, which, as I mentioned in video 1, teetered on the brink of failure in the early years after its settlement, the Powhatans tolerated that small English settlement because they hoped the English could provide consistent access to European trade goods that they desired. Most importantly, European-made metal goods, including guns, but also European-made iron and steel farm implements, for example. Excuse me. So the relationships between the Powhatans and the English were defined by hope on each side that they could take advantage of the other in order to have access to trade goods. Both sides hoped to have access to goods that the other had access to. But the relations were also defined by constant conflict. And this early conflict rose to a head in 1622, an event that the English called the Uprising of 1622. It was an attempt by the Powhatan Confederacy under the leadership of Wahunsa-Kawa's son, who would be Pocahontas' brother, who hoped that a surprise attack on the English settlements would once and for all force the English to leave the Chesapeake. Why? Because by 1622, according to Wahunsa-Kawa's successor, Pocahontas' brother, it became clear to Pocahontas' brother that the English would not be content simply maintaining a small trading post, but in fact wanted to expand their presence further inland, into Virginia, into the Chesapeake Bay. And his reaction was to attempt, as you can see, to force the English to leave by attacking their settlements, killing approximately 347 of the Virginian population. And that's a large number. And it also tells us by extension that the English population in early Virginia in 1622, that is, was a little less than 1,400, so very small. The hope was that the English would leave. That hope did not materialize. In response, the English attacked and massacred hundreds of Powhatan members of the Powhatan Confederacy. We don't have an exact number, but what we do know is that in the years after the uprising of 1622, the English held the balance of power in the Chesapeake Bay. At the same time, as we saw on the last screen, that it was set to become a royal colony in 1624. So we're seeing several different changes occur in a very short amount of time that really changed the trajectory of the Virginia colony and changed the overall balance of power in the Chesapeake. This doesn't mean that immediately after 1622 the Powhatans disintegrated, went away, but what it does mean is that retrospectively we can look back and see this as the beginning of a history in which the Powhatans slowly were pushed inland, farther and farther away from the Atlantic coast, and over time the Powhatan Confederacy disappeared. So that's the story, or I should say the early story, of the relationships between the English and the Powhatan. There we go. Thought I had another tech problem. Thank goodness I didn't. Now I want to shift gears and talk for the next two slides, and then I'll wrap this up, about economy and society in the Chesapeake. So you can go ahead and flip over to the next slide, which is called Economy and Society. And actually, before you do that, I forgot to mention this earlier. You can look at the two images that are below slides number 5 and 6, and you can see images of Pocahontas, which was a portrait made of her during her lifetime, and John Smith. So if you were to Google image, for example, Pocahontas and John Smith from the Disney movies, and then compare them to the actual portraits that we have of Pocahontas and of John Smith, you can see that they look very different than they are portrayed as in the Disney movie, especially John Smith, who does not have long flowing blonde hair, as you can see from his portrait. But back to the slide called Economy and Society in the Chesapeake. As we just mentioned, the decade of the 1620s is beginning to become a significant decade in the history of Virginia, as it transitions from company to society, as I just talked about in the first slide, as we see the English begin to gain the upper hand against the Powhatan Confederacy. We also see the economy of Virginia transform, and Virginia becomes a tobacco colony. So the first subpoint is just a couple of major turning points in this story. In 1616, a new kind of tobacco was introduced to Virginia. a kind of tobacco that came from the Caribbean that could be packaged and could withstand a long distance journey across the Atlantic to Europe. And in the 1620s, Virginia underwent what historians call a tobacco boom, which means that that decade, the 1620s, we see the economy of Virginia and therefore its society, which we'll talk about in a second, become very much centered around the production of tobacco. Tobacco at this time was a super valuable commodity in Europe and was very fashionable to both smoke tobacco, but also to sniff it in the form of snuff. But this transition had profound impacts on Virginia's society because of the nature of tobacco as a plant. And that is that tobacco is most profitably grown on large landholdings, on a large scale. Growing tobacco on a small scale is unprofitable because of the amount of labor that goes into producing tobacco, from planting its seeds to tending it as it grows, to picking it and curing it and packing it and getting it ready to ship to Europe. All of this takes a lot of labor. Tobacco, therefore, could only be grown, or I should say, could be grown profitably only on large estates. And so we begin to see Virginia in the 1620s during this tobacco boom shift to becoming a plantation economy. And indeed an economy in which slavery would ultimately become a significant component, which we'll talk about on our last slide. But because of, again, the nature of the production process of tobacco, what landowners and